episode 3.
All right.
We're still doing this. Awesome. And we're now actually live on some platforms, so that's good.
That is really cool. Stop it, Eric. All right. Serious now.
I mean, we'll try. So this week, Seth, you have Saint Gertrude for us.
Yes.
So tell us about her.
Okay, cool. So there's actually a lot about Gertrude. We could go in a lot of different ways, but it sounds like today we're going to talk about mysticism. So Gertrude is definitely an important mystical author, and she was a part of the Helfta community, which was renowned for its mysticism. There's several mystics there. There's 2 Gertrudes and 2 Mechtildes at Helfta. There's Gertrude the Great. There's also Gertrude of Hackeborn and Mechtilde of Hackeborn and Mechtilde of Magdeburg actually ended her life there. Mechtilde of Magdeburg was a Beguine, but she ended her life at Helfta with the Helfta community. So Gertrude the Great is really interesting. Well, Helfta is really interesting because they are a Benedictine community, but they wanted to be Cistercian, and that was a time period when the Cistercian order wasn't accepting any more women's communities. So they lived as Cistercians, but they were still officially Benedictines. I guess, I don't know exactly what the difference is. I guess it's the official, I don't know. Officially, they weren't Cistercians, but they lived the Cistercian lifestyle. That actually comes up kind of a lot with women's communities. But anyway, I digress. So Gertrude's really interesting because she writes about, she was an oblate member of the community, meaning she was brought into the community as a child rather than joining as an adult. And she writes about how she didn't really want to be a nun. So she was sort of forced into it because she was, given to the monastery as an oblate. And then she had this mystical, visionary experience of Christ when I think she was a teenager, and then started to appreciate her religious life and embraced it. Another interesting thing about the Helfta community, about Gertrude and Mechtilde and the whole community, is that they were all very educated women, and they wrote as a community. So Mechtilde's Book of Special Graces and parts of Gertrude's writings as well aren't just by themselves. They were a group effort by the community. So so the authorship was communal. And that brings up another point that I have talked about before, not on this podcast, but in other things that I've done, is that I think that you could make an argument that their mystical experiences were somewhat communal. So yeah, that's Gertrude. She is famous for her book, The Herald of Divine Love, which again was partially written by other members of the community. And she also, there's another collection of her works that's on, I can't remember what it is. I have it somewhere, but it's specifically on souls in purgatory, and it's something that I looked at when I did my master's thesis on purgatory, but I haven't really looked at it since then.
So I have a question. When you talk about them having sort of communal mystical experiences,
mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly sure what to make of that term, because
Well,
part of my brain is like, that's hippies in the desert dropping acid,
hmm
and but another part of my brain goes, that can't possibly be so. So if you could just give a brief description of what you mean by that.
sure. And I don't have the complete answer to that, and I may not be right about that with Helfta. Um, but there's two other communal mystical experiences that I have run across. The first one is the vision at Ostia between Augustine and Monica, where they essentially experience the same mystical experience together. They have the
Okay.
same vision. And then when I was talking about this before, it was on one of my own videos, my Coffee and Vespers videos
Mm-hmm.
on YouTube. Actually, no, that was on Instagram. But anyway, one of my viewers let me know that he felt that there was another one that's in the Little Flowers of St. Francis between Francis Clare and Francis's earliest followers, and I looked it up and it is in there. So Clare requests um, that she be able to leave the cloister to go have dinner with Francis. And he doesn't really want to do it. It's sort of like that same like Benedict and Scholastica story. He doesn't really want to do it, but eventually his followers are like, Claire's really done a lot for you, so you need to let her have dinner with you. So she is able to leave the cloister and comes and has dinner with Francis. But while they're eating, they have this communal vision, Francis, Clare, and the other Franciscans that are there. And it says something about how someone else comes in and they are all just enwrapped in this communal experience, and then they get shaken out of it. They didn't really eat anything, but they're edified by what happened. So, so
What
with
about
that,
the what about the La Salette children? Wouldn't that be considered communal vision?
um, yeah, and then I guess what we'd need to do, which I don't think we should probably do today, but we'd have to hash out, the difference between a mystical experience and a visionary experience.
Oh,
Um,
that's gonna take some time.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for
so
part two, mystical experience.
and well, for that matter, the Medjugorje seers as well.
Well, and Fatima with those children, and
Yeah. So anytime, so yeah, I think right. That's a good point.
so I think that
Um,
might be the difference between an apparition that's seen by many people, including like the dancing sun, um,
right. That was seen by like hundreds of people.
or something that's more like an actual, someone else busts in, they don't see anything, but as with the Franciscan story, everyone who was already there
hmm
was experiencing something.
Right. Yeah. That's a
And so
good.
that's sort of what was happening in this this convent that we were talking about.
Right. Helped.
Health.
Um. So, and maybe it's not fair to say they had a communal mystical experience because it's definite that the community as a community did the writing. So maybe it could be just like, they received the information and recorded it. But I think it's something I definitely think it's something that bears some research. I've never seen anyone. I mean, there's a lot of writings about Helfta, but I've never seen anything about, communal mystical experience. Maybe because it wasn't there. I don't know all that much about the Helfta community. I've just kind of read things here and there about it. Um, I have done some stuff with Gertrude, but it's been a while ago. So, um, but yeah, and I mean, what's the what's the point? You know, oh, if they had a communal mystical experience, that's great. Well, what does that teach us? So,
Yeah, definitely something to think about. Okay. Thank you, Seth.
oh, you're
Um,
welcome.
so for this week's heresy of the week, I am going to sort of be going in a sort of oppositional way to mysticism and going to be giving the quickest overview of Jansenism that I possibly can. Because if you don't do a very quick overview, you'll end up getting lost in it for hours into the weird history of it, even though it wasn't even around really for even a century. But so it was a Jansenism, which uh, the other reason I was covering this one is because I always hear people talk about it, but no one ever says what exactly the beliefs were. So Jansenism dated from about 1640 to 1788, roughly, and it was centered in the Port Royal Abbey in Paris. I mean, it clearly went throughout Paris and France, but that was sort of the theological center of it. And it started. Um, there were these two friends, Jansen and Duvergier, and Cornelius Jansen had written this book called Augustinus, that was very much inspired by the teachings of St. Augustine. And on his deathbed, he gave his manuscript to his friend Duvergier, and told him, run this by the Monsignor, see if it'll be good for people. But if the Holy See has a problem with it, shut it down. Like he was very clear on that. And apparently people after that didn't get that message. And so basically the teachings they claim to have been coming from Augustine's system of thought, but they take things a little farther than he does, and that's where they start getting into some heretical thought. And if you want to think of it in one bullet point, think of it as a Calvinist version of Catholicism with some minor differences, but that's really like the essence of it. That basically people are justified by faith, not works. But unlike Calvinism, there's no doctrine of assurance. So if you're familiar with that old, there's an old hymn that I hear a lot in America among the Protestants, Blessed Assurance. That concept is a Calvinist concept that, oh, if you're of the elect and you're saved, you're fine. There's nothing you can do to lose that. But Jansenism actually rejected that part of Calvinism. So the core of the heresy is that it denies the role of free will in the acceptance or use of grace. And Jansen insisted that God's infusion of grace cannot be resisted and does not require human assent. And that was really the core of why the church, the Jesuits specifically, and the Pope, just it became this huge controversy. So this sort of starts percolating 1640 and after. And in 1653, Pope Innocent X issues a papal bull, Cum Occasione, and he specifically condemned 5 Jansenist propositions in that bull. And the first was that he condemns that the idea that there are some commandments of God that just men cannot keep no matter how hard they wish or strive. So basically, all your efforts, you're just never going to be able to do some things that God wants. The second proposition that was condemned by the Pope is that it is impossible for fallen man to resist sovereign grace. Again, this is nixing the concept of free will, which sort of works into the next one. He was condemning the proposition that it is possible for human beings who lack free will, therefore, if we've already established that they have no free will, then to merit in the theological sense, which is to do a work that is positively good, and it's positively good because it has its roots in the gratuitous grace of God, but there's no actual merit to it if you don't have free will. The fourth proposition that the Pope condemned was they had this teaching that the semi-Pelagians were correct that grace was necessary for all interior acts, including faith, but were incorrect to teach that fallen men are free to accept or reject grace. So to understand that proposition, you kind of have to have a bit of an understanding of what semi-Pelagianism is. And so briefly, first you have the Pelagians, who taught that basically men can affect their own salvation through will, that you can basically, if you're a good guy and you do good works, you can get into heaven. That is just, you can earn your way into heaven, basically. That's Pelagian thought. And then semi-Pelagian, and its original idea is sort of a compromise between Pelagianism and what ended up being the orthodox teaching of St. Augustine, among others. In semi-Pelagian thought, there's a distinction made between the beginning of faith and the increase in faith. And the semi-Pelagians taught that the latter half, the growing in faith, is the work of God, while the beginning of faith is an act of free will. So basically, you say, I decide that I'm going to have faith, and then grace responds. That's the semi-Pelagian heresy. Whereas the orthodox teaching is that grace starts it, that if you even want to have faith, that is because grace is already at work in your life. And so that's why they're back to the Jansenists, their proposition that they were saying that it was incorrect that fallen men are free to accept or reject grace. And then the fifth proposition that the Pope condemns in this bull is that they said that it was semi-Pelagian to say that Christ died for all. And this sort of harkens back to the concept in Calvinism, and you do have it to a lesser extent in some versions of Catholic orthodoxy, that there are some people who are elect, are chosen. And my understanding of, and I could be incorrect on some of this, my understanding of a lot of the fight even in Catholicism is that some are elect, but no one is automatically condemned, whereas in Calvinism, and I think in semi-Pelagianism, either you're elect or there's nothing you can do. So that is
and that's essentially Augustine. I mean, that's pretty much what Augustine thought too,
yeah,
right?
That yes, it's been a couple years since I last read Augustine, but my recollection is that he's like, yeah, there are some people who are elect that God is going to some special effort for, but that it's open for anyone.
But yeah,
but Calvinists
thought most people weren't going to make it.
Yeah, whereas Calvinist thought it sort of has this double election.
Right.
And listeners, if any of you are Calvinist and I'm getting this wrong, please feel free to correct me. There's sort of a double election where there are those who are elected to go to heaven and then those who are elected to go to hell. And those who are elected to go to hell, there is nothing they can do.
Right.
But I also think it's slightly different between Calvinism and Augustine too.
Well,
I mean,
yes.
Augustine didn't think that people were going to make it, but not because they were elect or not elect.
Well, yeah.
They felt people weren't going to make it because of their own sinfulness and free will,
exactly.
which is where the beef comes in, really. You
know? There is a difference between Augustine and Calvin in that
for sure.
They both kind of say, yeah, there are some people who seem to be chosen for heaven. It's just who makes up the rest of everyone else. Is it everyone else is damned, which is the Calvinist thought, or Augustine's thought, which is it's up to everyone else to choose their own side?
And I think
And Catholic
Augustine
thought
in
will also
City.
tell you that if you are elect, God may be going to special efforts for you, but you can still mess it up.
There's also different Augustines. I mean,
Yes.
same guy, but traditional Confessions Augustine probably would have said most people aren't going to make it, but I don't think City of God Augustine would have said the same thing. I think
Yeah,
he would
and
have
City of
had a
God is what
different
I was
take on
reading
it.
at the time. So that's what I remember from there. So basically, Jansenist thought is it's very when I was reading up on it, it's very like you get with the Calvinists, a lot about just the awful, wretched state of humans, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's an ultimately very depressing idea that they have. So, anyways, that was condemned. If you get into the history of it, and we might at some later podcast, you get these weird splinter groups, especially at the end. Um, you get the convulsionaires who just they get weird. Like they get super weird. Um, but yeah, it all finally like the last remnants are in 1788. And I realized briefly before I misread something. I said Jansenism wasn't around for a century. It was around for a little over a century, almost a century and a half. So 1788, sort of where we have the last remnants, and the Port Royal Abbey was demolished. The nuns and the convent were scattered throughout France to different abbeys, and there was basically a huge crackdown. Cardinal Richelieu got involved at one point. It's very involved. But that's basically what Jansenism is and when it was. And that's our overview.
Cool.
So, Erica, what bit of culture did you want to discuss with us this week?
So I am going to talk about the movie Vision. Um, and let me get back to my computer because I had to walk away to deal with a whiny 3-year-old who does not want me working right now. Surprise!
It happens.
All
Children.
right. The movie Vision is actually a great movie, and it ties into what we're talking about with our mysticism, which you kind of want to think more towards Seth's discussion on Gertrude than you want to think about the Jansenis or Augustine. The movie Vision it's called Vision from the Life of Hildegard von Bingen, and it's a German movie. It was done by Zeitgeist Films, and in the US, it was released on October 13th in 2010. So it's 9 years old this year, 10th anniversary next year. It's a good time to watch it. It's about an hour and 51 minutes. For those of you who care, I do. I have to know how long the movies are that I'm going to watch to see if I can actually fit them in before there's a little tot that wakes up. The film itself, though, draws on the life of Hildegard von Bingen, who was a Christian mystic. And, well, not just a Christian mystic. She was a Christian mystic. She was an abbess. She was a talented musician, composer, poet, scientist. She knew pharmacology. She knew agriculture. She was pretty much like the OG Renaissance woman from, well, 300 years before the Renaissance even took place. But I guess
Totally one of
fashionably,
my heroes.
she is. She's amazing and fashionably early in everything that she did. So, excuse me. She became the abbess eventually to her sisters. Oh, let's backtrack a little bit. Her dates are 1098 to 1179. So very early on. And she was a religious in the order of Saint Benedict, which Seth can tell you infinitely more about than I can, but that's for another time. So eventually she became the abbess to a community of nuns, and that's really where the movie Vision focuses. Now, Hildegard started having visions when she was 3 years old. That's pretty darn early. Uh,
I didn't
What I
realize
can
it was that early. Like I thought she was at least in her teens, but really when she was
No,
3?
3 years old. And I can tell you this 3-year-old that I'm looking at right now does not have any visions other than of mommy, mommy, mommy needing something. But yet I digress. So 3 years old, she started having visions. And when she began to write them down, as she told her confessor at the time, and I believe that this is all documented somewhere, her visions scared her. So she said they were so strong that as a 3-year-old, she was petrified, and she would tell her nanny, because she came from a wealthy family, and the nanny would basically say that these were visions of God. She shouldn't be scared, but nonetheless, 3-year-old having visions, that's pretty intense. When she talked about her visions, she talks about them being reflections of living light, illuminations, and she focuses on talking about seeing God throughout time. So, not at one point in time. And this is part of what is so beautiful about her vision, is that it's really the creation. And yeah, really, if you read her words, she just has a way of putting things. I mean, she was a poet. The movie picks up, and it does go into her background, but really focuses on her later life and some of the struggles she has. Eventually, she gets the go ahead to write down her visions, and this kind of causes trouble because she wants to move the abbey. She was an anchorite. So, for those of you who don't know what an anchorite is, basically they are anchored to a monastery. They're often fed through grates, but that's not in the end the life that she saw herself having. She wanted to be more a part of the community, and definitely, certainly for her cloister of nuns. And so she starts to reach out a little bit more, and she talks about her visions, and she is extremely intelligent. So she's kind of able to play some of the political game going on too. And you need to watch the movie. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but you see what happens in the end when it comes to her nuns and what she goes through. But many popes who disagree with each other have called her courageous and formidable. And these, again, are popes who don't necessarily have the same theological bent. So, yeah, Hildegard von Bingen, her life in the movie Vision, and it is extremely recommended. Uh, it can be watched by all ages, and it's a very beautiful movie too. I mean, it's just the filmography is gorgeous. It's very well done. So that's my recommendation on mystic movie watching for the week. Or you can watch Harry Potter. I'll do both.
I mean, awesome. But I can't get through a holiday season at my parents' house without someone tripping across Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. So I think I'll go for Hildegard.
You can go for Hildegard. I mean,
I
I
mean, the
like
Black
all.
Basilisk is cool, but I think I'll go for Hildegard.
There's no basilisk in Hildegard, but it's
No.
definitely good. Erica, I think you mentioned this, but it is a German film, so it does have subtitles.
Yes, for those of you who have problems reading, that was very snippy of me. Oh well. For those of you who have problems reading or just don't like reading subtitles, um, yes, it is in German. I mean, it's
Considering the
okay.
amount of subtitled anime I watch, I think I'll be fine.
Oh, yeah, you'll be fine. But
I'll be fine. Yeah.
some people are gonna be like, I don't want to go to the movies to read my movie.
Well, and my
It's
dad
fine, people.
doesn't
It's
like it.
okay. You can
He
do it.
finds he can't keep up with the speed of subtitles a lot of times.
All right, but I like your dad, so he's forgiven.
Yeah, he's cool. So he's, you know, there are reasons why people might have trouble with them.
You're being
Legitimate
very
reasons.
forgiving. I'm not being forgiving on this.
That's okay. I'm very unforgiving on other matters, so we'll take
That's
turns.
that's true. we'll we'll split the difference. That's
Yeah,
absolutely
yeah,
true.
yeah. Awesome. So we'll definitely look into that. So what when when we were kind of discussing this earlier, both pre-show and when Erica and I were discussing, in text and in phone calls in previous days, I know that one thing the three of us have in common is a sort of, or at least we did back in college. I don't know if it's still true. It might be. I suspect it is.
Reveal.
I suspect it is. We have a sort of an inclination toward the mystics. Yeah, because Seth, you would almost have to because of what you generally work with. An
I mean, my
inclination
whole
toward
business is
mysticism,
mystic.
which, at least in my experience, was very poorly served by the church, and in trying to get direction when I was coming up. And part of it is because there's this false dichotomy that you run into, that's about as old as the church is. And when I've discussed things with Erica on previous occasions, and she talks about the divide between like Rome and Alexandria, or maybe even Rome and Jerusalem, but where you start, even in the very beginning, you have these divides between the Eastern approach and the Western approach, and you have the one that's more philosophically and even more flexible regarding mystical experiences. And on the Western Roman half, you've got very, it's all about reason and law, um, and things are not quite as flexible. And of course, it's not like a clear cut thing, and it's not everyone falls down at the extremes, but there do seem to be these tendencies, and in a lot of what I've encountered, both in sort of the pop theologians that you find on YouTube, um, or parish priests, there's so much of an emphasis on very linear, almost I would say like the Thomistic type of thought. Um, and so a lot of times people, as a result, there's this action reaction, sort of the forced Hegelian dialectic between everyone falling down on one side or another, where, at least in my mind, it shouldn't be sides, because I think you need both. Um, I've seen that I don't want to call them legalists because that seems like slander. Um, the less mystical, less mystically inclined pundits and theologians, they get really wigged out by mysticism. And I know that in the extreme, if there's no discipline in mysticism, you end up in fluffy New Age bunny land, where everything is rainbows and happiness, and ultimately lies. But I guess that's sort of my reflection on, sort of a problem I have with how the current church, at the very least, treats people whose natural inclinations are of a more spiritual and less give me the rules type, of approach. And I was wondering, if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Well, one thing to tie it back to the movie that Erica brought up, there's a really great part. I haven't seen that film for a few years, but I used to show parts of it in my classes, and there's a part I believe I remember where Hildegard is kind of wrestling with whether her visions are authentic or not. And you see that in visionary or in mystical literature quite a bit. Is like, is this a real experience, or am I just being like kind of led astray?
Mhm.
So there's that. I guess the mysticism kind of pushes the boundaries. And so that's why mystics usually are pretty suspect during their lives. Hildegard is definitely an anomaly there, because her writings, where she was asked to write down her visions by the Pope, and she was given the authority to teach in public. But a lot of mystics are seen pretty, seen as kind of suspicious, and then usually after they've died, we recognize how great they are. But I don't know. I think part of it is just because they're kind of wild. Like the mystics, have these experiences, and they're not easily boxed in. Even the mystics themselves say, I don't really know how to write about this. I'm just going to do my best. So I think that that's challenging for the church. Sometimes can be, at least.
Hmm.
I know my aunt was in a reading group at her parish, and they were just reading some of the women mystics like Hildegard and Hadewig and Mechthild. Um, and the parish priest came into one of their meetings and was like, I want to sit in on this, and see what's going on. And eventually disbanded the group because he felt threatened by it, which is stupid. I mean, there's no reason to be threatened by it. The mystics are just, you know, giving us their experience of God, which is profoundly, it's an other way of understanding it, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that unfortunately also filters down sometimes. I can't tell you how many times I've encountered priests, and especially on the conservative end of theology, which is my sort of my instinctive, where I find myself a lot of times on many things aligning, though not all. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people on that side of things just say that, you know, absolutely condemn meditation, blanket statement, um, as though we didn't have a 2,000-year very Catholic, very Orthodox tradition of meditation, as though the apophatic approach, as though the via negativa wasn't ever a thing. Um, but you have this attitude that if it's not the rosary, if it's not formulaic spoken prayer, you absolutely need to stay away from it because it's far too dangerous, um, for lay people to deal with. And to which my automatic thought is, if someone is asking God for guidance and assistance, how is he supposed to provide guidance if the person praying never shuts up? Which is what meditation is. It's when you stop talking, or you talk yourself out until there's nothing left, and then you listen. Um, you give God a chance to get a word in edgewise. Um, and I think that maybe
I
it's the
think
same thing that Seth mentioned, that there's that loss of that concern over someone straying from the path because you don't know what's going on with them.
so. Being slightly on the more cynical side, that was a nice alliteration. I always love a good
Mm-hmm.
alliteration. I would say that there's probably another issue going on here, and one of the things I'm finding in what I'm working on now in ethics is, what is the agenda and what's the goal, to put it in non-theological terms, of the person or group acting. And when a group acts, and I'm going to categorize the hierarchy as a government right now, because
Mm-hmm.
in fairness, they acted as a government for a very, 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 very long time and kind of still do. So,
Well, they are
categor-
absolutely still a bureaucracy.
yeah,
So,
categorizing them as a government, I would say that their goal and their agenda on behalf of the citizens, the
Mm-hmm.
the masses of the church, is never going to be the same goal as the individual. And mysticism is a very individual relationship with God, and not, I mean, we're, aside from the communal mysticism that we had talked about. But basically, it's a very intense, deep, personal relationship, or experience of the divine. And I think on more of a hierarchical, ethical level, I'm not sure that it serves the church well to function in diving into mystics all the time. Um, that's not to say that I don't think that some of the hierarchy believe in mystics. I absolutely believe that they do. But especially back when we go back to Hildegard, what was the purpose of her mysticism? It didn't fit with what they wanted. Her mysticism was basically allowing her to break the common tradition and the laws and the roles that were set up before her, and they really hated that. So she's functioning as a person who is responsible for a group of sisters, the closest people to her in her lives, and their functioning, their goals, their agenda is entirely different. So the two never meet. And you're right, Christine. I don't think they have to be so dichotomous. I think there is space for them to match up and to meet, especially in this day and age where we have meta thinking. We can discuss, we can talk about thinking, um, but we haven't yet, and that's kind of strange. I think we're still arguing over petty things instead of going back and regaining some of the things that we've lost over the years, like this draw, um, to mysticism, or even just listening to the mystics. Hildegard had hundreds of people write to her in her time for advice because her visions were so powerful to them. They meant so much to these individuals. And she answered them. She took the time to answer them. That's pretty incredible, when you think about it. So yeah, I think there's a big divide, and somehow we need to start bridging that. But Seth, question for you, because you probably know more than I do on this. Modern day mystics, like you know, who would you go to and say is a true modern day mystic?
You mean like alive right now and active, or do you mean like in the 20th century?
I would say, I mean, I think 20th century is fair. I think even 19th century is fair.
Sure. Well, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is Adrian von Speyer, um, who was so influential on Hans Urs von Balthasar. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I the mystics I deal with are like, medieval and pre-modern, so early modern. So that's the first one that
But
pops into my mind. I'm sure there's others.
but we're two theologians, right? Who have never, other than Adrian von Speyer, have never been really exposed to modern mystics. I mean, and that's fascinating all in itself. Like, we've had no readings on modern mystics. Um, it really dropped off. And I think in general, our turn towards science has really taken over. Not that
Oh,
science is bad, y'all. I love
well,
science.
yeah, I mean, if you want to go that route, the only reason I've read so many mystics is because I sought them out. Like mystics weren't a big part of our education. We read some. We read Catherine of Siena, and um, I mean, who else did we read? A lot of our stuff wasn't mysticism. We read Pseudo Dionysius. We read some Bonaventure, but I mean, a
Teresa
lot
of
of that.
Avila.
Yeah, we read Teresa.
Yeah.
Did we? Oh yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. Yeah, we did.
We didn't do a ton of Teresa though.
No, we only had two women on our reading list at all. It was Teresa and Catherine. We didn't have any modern women. even theologically, not mysticism aside, we only had 2 women on our entire reading list for comps. And I know that list is different now, but at the time, 10 years ago or whenever it was.
I'm not
Anyways,
sure I
well,
can do that again.
Did you just say
All right.
something
So
really
basically,
profound?
what I said was that our one listener out there, go out and be mystical. Go meditate, for God's sake. Go do something and just be quiet for a little bit and find God in the world, not in a prayer book, not in the scriptures, not in mass. Go find God within yourself in a very quiet place. And we promise you it will be more than worth it.
if I may also recommend, there's 2 things. One thing I learned when I was desperate and searching for any kind of guidance at all, I did run across the practice of Lectio Divina. So that is something you may want to look up and investigate. And there's also an app that I have called Abide. They are not a sponsor of this podcast, but I'm going to recommend them anyhow. And it is it's not Catholic, it is Christian though, meditation that focuses on prayer and scripture, but also giving that silent space to lay things before God, but then also allow God to lay things before you and to have that encounter. And so far, I've not found anything objectionable, though to be fair, my boundary on where things are or are not unacceptable is probably very different than many other people's lines. But I think so far I haven't found anything that anyone would find objectionable. It's very scripture based. So I
Yeah,
would recommend that.
I definitely would echo that. Lectio is a big part of our Benedictine tradition. So the oblate group that I'm a part of does Lectio at every single meeting. And it's definitely recommended by Benedict in the rule, as is being silent and listening for God's voice. So totally agreed.
And I'm certain we will, knowing the 3 of us, again, this is mysticism part 1 of probably infinite. We're definitely going to hit this again, just because we tend toward it. So closing thoughts from anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree we could go on about this for a while, so maybe we just put a bookmark in it and pick
Okay.
up at another episode, because we just scratched the surface of some of these issues.
Indeed.
We're not putting a ring on it yet.
It's if you
Well,
like it, you gotta put a ring on it. Wasn't
no,
that what?
that's what Saint Gertrude does with her, being the bride of Christ and all of that. They do that.
One thing that strikes me that I didn't even think about when we were planning this episode is we talked about 3 women's communities, 3 women's monastic communities in this podcast. We talked about Helfta, we talked about Port Royal, and we
Yes.
talked about Hildegard's community.
Huh.
So all 3 of these communities kind of approached theology a different way. 2 of
Yeah.
them are, Orthodox, and then Port Royal is not. So that's interesting. I think the way that the church and society reacted to those 3 communities is very different. And so there's probably some political, social stuff happening there as well. But
Maybe we can discover that on a future episode.
yeah, that would be kind of cool, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been great, and we'll bring this episode to a close. So now that we're live online, um, listeners, let us know what you think. There should be an email posted with with the cast. If not, we will probably be setting up social media within the next few days, and it should be live soon. So let us know there. Thank you and have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.